rooms, even that money disappeared. That's when they found it, an abandoned county jail at the end of a gravel road with rusted bars, broken windows, and cells untouched for decades. The price? Just $6. Frank looked at the crumbling structure and said, "It's still standing." Dorothy ran her hand across the cold iron bars and replied, "Then we can make it a home." 6 months later, when a town official arrived expecting to condemn the place, he stepped inside and froze, because what they had built inside those prison walls was something no one could have imagined. But I need to take you back to the beginning. Back before the jail, before the $6, before the gravel road, back to who Frank and Dorothy Mercer were before the world decided they didn't matter anymore. Frank was a carpenter. 42 years of framing houses, laying hardwood floors, building additions for families who needed more room. His hands told the whole story. Scarred across the knuckles, calloused at the palms, the left index finger crooked from a bad break in 1981 that he never got properly set because he couldn't afford to miss a day of work. He'd built his first bookshelf at 14 and never stopped building after that. Dorothy taught third grade at Millbrook Elementary for 35 years. She was the teacher who stayed late, who bought school supplies with her own money, who learned every child's name by the second day. When she retired at 68, the school gave her a plaque and a cake. She kept the plaque in a drawer and gave the cake to the neighbors. They raised their 3 children in a 4-room house on Barker Street. Nothing fancy. Frank built the porch himself, added a half bath when the kids were small, and put a new roof on every 12 years whether it needed it or not. Dorothy kept the kitchen warm and the homework done, and the arguments short. They weren't rich. They were the kind of people who made a little stretch into enough. Their eldest, Stephen, was always the ambitious one. Smart, driven, certain from age 15 that he was meant for bigger things than Barker Street. Frank and Dorothy paid for his college by refinancing the house. Dorothy picked up tutoring jobs on weekends. Frank took every overtime shift the union offered. Stephen graduated, got into real estate development, and moved to a city 3 hours south. He did well. Corner office, new car every 2 years, a house with rooms he didn't use. Their daughter, the middle child, became an accountant. Steady, quiet, cautious. She married young and settled 2 towns over. She called on Sundays mostly. Their young moved to the West Coast and called less and less as the years went on. Frank and Dorothy didn't complain. They'd done what parents do. They'd given everything so their children could have more. And their children did have more. Just not more time for them. The first sign came when Frank turned 74. Dorothy noticed he was slower on the stairs. Forgetting where he put his reading glasses, asking the same question twice at dinner. She didn't say anything because Frank was proud, and pride was the one thing he had plenty of. But she called Stephen and mentioned it casually the way you mentioned weather. Stephen said he'd look into options. He looked into options for 2 years. Then, one Saturday morning in March, Stephen pulled into the driveway in his black SUV. He hadn't visited in 8 months. He brought his sister. The youngest didn't come. Stephen said he was too busy with a project. "We found a place for you," Stephen said, standing in the kitchen where Dorothy had cooked 10,000 meals. "It's a nice facility, very clean, good reviews. You'll be comfortable there." Dorothy set down her coffee cup. "A facility. It's temporary," Stephen said, "just until we figure out the house situation. The property taxes went up again, and with Dad's medical costs, the numbers don't work anymore." "What numbers?" Frank asked from the doorway. "The finances, Dad. We've been over this." They hadn't been over anything. Stephen had never once sat down with his parents and discussed their finances, but he spoke with the confidence of a man who'd built a career on making uncomfortable things sound reasonable. Dorothy looked at her daughter standing behind Stephen with her arms crossed and her eyes on the floor. "Did you know about this?" Her daughter nodded, didn't speak. "We're not going to a facility," Frank said. "Dad, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. This is our home. I built half of it with my own hands." Stephen rubbed his temples. "It's a temporary arrangement. A few weeks, maybe a month. Just until we sort things out." Dorothy watched her son's face. She'd spent 35 years reading children's faces, knowing when a child was lying about homework or hiding a hurt. She saw it clearly. Stephen wasn't sorting anything out. Stephen was clearing a problem off his desk. But Frank believed him. Frank, who'd never broken a promise in his life, couldn't imagine his own son breaking one. So he packed 2 suitcases. That's what 42 years of marriage, 42 years of carpentry, 35 years of teaching came down to. 2 suitcases and whatever fit inside. Dorothy packed clothes, medication, Frank's reading glasses, her Bible, and 1 photograph. Their wedding day, 1972. Frank in a borrowed suit, Dorothy in her mother's dress, both of them grinning like they'd already won. She put the photograph in her purse. She wasn't sure why. Something told her she'd need proof that they'd once been young and certain about the future. Stephen drove them to a motel off the highway. Not a senior living facility. A motel. The Pineview Motor Lodge with a neon sign missing 2 letters in a parking lot full of potholes. "This is temporary," Stephen said again, unloading the suitcases onto the curb. "I'll call you this week." He didn't call that week. Or the next. Dorothy tried him on the 3rd day. Voicemail. She tried the youngest. The number had been disconnected. Frank sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at his hands. "They'll call back," he said. Stephen said he'd sort it out. "Frank," he said, "a few weeks." Dorothy sat beside him and took his hand. She didn't argue. There was no point in arguing with hope. The motel cost $30 a night, cash only. The room smelled like carpet cleaner and cigarette smoke. The heater rattled but worked. The shower ran hot for exactly 4 minutes before going cold. They made it stretch. Dorothy bought bread and peanut butter from the gas station across the road. Frank fixed the dripping bathroom faucet on the 2nd day, just out of habit. The motel manager, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, noticed and asked if he could look at a broken door hinge in room 12. Frank fixed it. She knocked 2 nights off their bill. But $220 at $39 a night doesn't last. Dorothy did the math on the back of a gas station receipt. They had maybe 5 days before the money ran out completely. "We could try the church," Dorothy said. "I'm not taking charity. Frank, we're living in a motel room with a broken television and a pillow that smells like someone else's hair. We are the charity." He looked at her. She looked at him. He almost smiled. They went to the church. The pastor was kind but honest. He could put them up for 2 nights in the fellowship hall. After that, the best he could do was a list of shelters in the county. Shelters. Frank Mercer, who'd built houses with his bare hands for 4 decades, was looking at a list of shelters. They spent those 2 nights on cots in the fellowship hall, surrounded by folding chairs and the faint smell of Sunday coffee. Dorothy slept. Frank didn't. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning the same question over in his mind. How did we get here? On the 2nd morning, Dorothy walked to the county office building 2 blocks from the church. She'd taught 3rd graders for 35 years. She knew how to find information and who to ask. She told the clerk at the property records desk that she and her husband needed a place to live and had almost no money. The clerk, a young woman with glasses and a kind expression, typed something into her computer and frowned. "There's a tax sale listing that's been sitting for years. Nobody wants it. It's an old county jail about 12 miles east of town off Hadley Road. It's been abandoned since the 90s. "How much?" Dorothy asked. $6. That's the minimum the county can accept. "What condition is it in?" The clerk hesitated. "It's standing. That's about all I can tell you." Dorothy walked back to the fellowship hall and told Frank what she'd found. "A jail," he said. "A building," she said, "with walls and a roof." "Dorothy, it's a jail. It's $6, Frank. We have $11 left." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Can we see it?" The pastor drove them out that afternoon, 12 miles east, past cornfields and empty lots, until the paved road turned to gravel. The gravel road went on for another mile, narrowing between overgrown ditches and leaning fence posts, until it ended at a clearing. The jail sat at the center like something the land was trying to swallow. 2 stories of gray stone, with barred windows on every side and a front entrance flanked by concrete pillars that had cracked and shifted over the decades. The roof was intact but sagging. Weeds grew through the front steps. A chain hung loose across the door. The padlock rusted open. Frank got out of the car slowly. He stood there looking at it the way a carpenter looks at anything. He wasn't seeing the ruin, he was seeing the bones. "The foundation's limestone," he said. "That's why it's still standing. They built these things to last." Dorothy got out and walked to the entrance. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The main corridor stretched ahead, dim and cold, with cells lining both sides. Iron bars floor to ceiling, concrete floors stained with decades of neglect. A processing desk sat near the entrance, its surface covered in dust and mouse droppings. A bulletin board on the wall still held a faded notice from 1993. She walked to the nearest cell and reached through the bars. The space inside was about 8 feet by 10. Small, but the walls were solid, the ceiling intact. No leaks that she could see. She ran her hand across the cold iron bars. Frank came up behind her. "Well, the walls are dry," she said. "The floor is level, it's cold, but it's solid. It's a jail, Dorothy. It's $6, Frank, and it's ours if we want it." He put his hand on the bars next to hers, tested them. Solid iron, bolted into stone. "Not going anywhere. We raised 3 children in a 4-room house," Dorothy said. "I think we can manage a few jail cells." Frank looked at her. 42 years of marriage and she could still surprise him. He pulled out his wallet, counted out $6, and handed them to the pastor. "Would you mind dropping these at the county office for us?" The pastor looked at the money, then at the jail, then at Frank. "Are you sure about this?" "No," Frank said, "but I'm sure about her." They spent their first night on the concrete floor of the cell closest to the front entrance. Frank wedged the outer door shut with a piece of wood. Dorothy folded her coat into a pillow and laid it on the floor. They had no electricity, no running water, no heat. The November air came through the broken windows and settled into everything. Frank lay beside her in the dark. He could hear wind moving through the corridor, rattling loose things, making the building moan. It sounded alive, not welcoming exactly, but not hostile either, just waiting. "Frank?" Dorothy's voice in the dark. "Yeah, we're going to be all right." He reached for her hand, found it, held it. "I know," he said. Even though he didn't, sometime in the night Dorothy got up. Frank heard her moving around, heard fabric tearing, heard the scrape of metal. He sat up and watched her silhouette in the faint moonlight that came through the barred window. She had torn a strip from the lining of her suitcase, a piece of burgundy fabric about 2 feet wide. She was tying it to the bars of their cell, stretching it across like a curtain, pulling it taut and knotting it at both ends. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at it. The fabric caught the moonlight and glowed faintly against the iron. "There," she said. "Now it's a window." Frank watched her from the floor. This woman who had given 35 years to other people's children and raised 3 of her own and been driven to a motel and then a church and then a jail and still had the will to hang a curtain. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just lay back down, held her hand again, and for the first time in weeks, he slept. Frank woke at dawn. The light came through the barred windows in pale stripes, falling across the concrete floor in a pattern that would have looked like a cage to most people. Frank saw something else. He saw geometry. He saw structure. He saw a building that had kept standing for 60 years because someone had built it right. He stood slowly, his knees protesting the concrete floor, and walked the length of the corridor. 12 cells, 6 on each side, each one about 8 by 10 feet, with iron bars on the front and solid stone on the remaining 3 walls. High ceilings, maybe 10 feet. A narrow window in each cell, barred but intact. Beyond the cell block, a processing area near the front entrance, a larger room in the back that might have been a common area or mess hall, a set of stairs leading to a second floor with 6 more cells and what looked like an office. The roof was mostly sound, 2 spots where water had gotten in, but the damage was contained. The plumbing was old, iron pipes that had been shut off at the main valve for decades, but Frank could see where the connections ran. The electrical panel was ancient and dead, but the conduit was still in the walls. He came back to their cell and found Dorothy sitting up, folding her coat. "The bones are good," he said. "I can work with this. I know you can. I'm going to need tools." Dorothy reached into her purse and pulled out the $5 they had left. She held it out. Frank looked at the money. $5. For tools, for supplies, for everything they'd need to turn a condemned jail into something livable. "That won't buy a hammer," he said. "Then we'll have to get creative." Frank started with what was already there. The inner corridor had 18 iron bars running along one section where a dividing wall had once separated the processing area from the cell block. Each bar was solid steel, about 4 feet long and an inch thick. He worked them loose over the course of 2 days, using a pry bar he found in a storage closet near the back. The closet also held a rusted toolbox with a claw hammer, a handsaw with a dull blade, a level that still read true, and a coffee can full of assorted nails. Somebody had left maintenance supplies behind when the jail closed, and 30 years later, Frank Mercer opened that closet like it was Christmas morning. He loaded the 18 iron bars into a wheelbarrow he found behind the building and pushed it to the road. Then he waited. A pickup truck came along after about 20 minutes. Frank waved it down. The driver, a farmer heading to town, looked at the old man standing on the gravel road with a wheelbarrow full of iron bars and didn't ask many questions. "Scrapyard still open on Route 9, Frank asked. "Open every day, but Sunday. Can I get a ride?" The scrapyard paid him $62 for the bars. Frank walked to the hardware store on the town's main street and stood outside for a minute doing math in his head. $62 plus their remaining $5, $67 total. He needed lumber, screws, pipe fittings, and electrical wire. $67 would barely cover the lumber. He walked in. Anyway, the store was called Hobbs Hardware, and it had been on that corner for 40 years. The man behind the counter was about Frank's age, maybe a little older, with thick arms and a face that looked like it had been carved from a piece of hardwood and then left in the weather for a few decades. "Help you," the man said. "I need supplies," Frank said. "I've got $67 and a lot of work to do." "What kind of work?" "I bought the old county jail off Hadley Road. My wife and I are fixing it up." The man set down the invoice he'd been reading. "You bought that place, $6. That place has been empty since I was 50. It's not empty anymore." The man studied Frank for a long moment, looked at his hands, the scarred knuckles, the calloused palms, the crooked index finger. "You're a tradesman," the man said. "Carpenter. 42 years. The man came around the counter and extended his hand. "Earl Hobbs." "What do you need?" Frank told him. Earl listened without interrupting, then walked Frank through the store pulling items off shelves. Lumber scraps from cut orders that nobody wanted, a box of mismatched screws, a partial roll of electrical wire, 2 pipe fittings that were the wrong size for the order they'd been pulled for. When they got to the register, Earl punched numbers and then looked at Frank. $67 even. Frank knew that wasn't right. The lumber alone was worth more than that. But Earl rang it up and bagged it with the steady expression of a man who wasn't going to discuss it further. "I'll pay you back the difference," Frank said. No difference to pay. Those were clearance items. They both knew that wasn't true. Frank took the bags and nodded. "Thank you, Earl. Come back when you need more. I've always got clearance items." Frank carried the supplies back to the jail on foot, 3 miles, uphill on a gravel road with a bad knee and 67 years of wear on his body. It took him 2 hours. He stopped twice to rest. Both times he looked at the supplies in his arms and kept going. Dorothy had been busy while he was gone. She'd swept the entire first-floor corridor with a broom made from a branch and a handful of dried grass tied with string. She'd cleaned the processing desk until the wood grain showed through. She'd collected every piece of trash, every dead mouse, every fragment of broken glass and piled it all outside the front entrance. "Found a well out back," she said when Frank walked in. "Hand pump. Took some work, but it runs clear." Frank set the supplies down. "We've got water, cold water, but it's clean." That was the second night. They had water, a broom, a basic toolkit, and $67 worth of supplies. Frank started on the first cell that evening, working until the light faded. He pulled the bars from the front of the cell, leaving the frame intact, fitted a piece of salvaged lumber across the opening as a header, used the remaining bars to build a frame for a door, which he hung on hinges he'd pried from the storage closet. Then he built a bed frame from lumber scraps, sized to fit a mattress if they ever got one, But for now, he laid boards across the top and covered them with their coats. Dorothy washed the cell walls with well water, and a rag torn from a shirt that had been in one of the suitcases. She hung another piece of fabric across the window. She placed their wedding photograph on a small shelf Frank had nailed to the wall. When they were done, they stood in the doorway and looked at it. A room, small, plain, cold, but a room. It's not much, Frank said. It's ours, Dorothy said. That makes it plenty. Word reached town slowly, the way it does in small places. The pastor mentioned it to his congregation. Earl told a few customers. A woman who owned the diner heard about it and drove out one afternoon with a box of blankets and a bag of canned food. She pulled up in her station wagon and sat there for a minute looking at the jail. Then she got out, walked to the front entrance, and called inside. Dorothy came to the door. The woman held out the box. "I heard about you too," she said. "I brought some things." Dorothy looked at the blankets, the cans of soup and beans, the jar of instant coffee. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "Thank you," she said. "Would you like to come in and see what we're doing?" The woman came in. She walked the corridor. She looked at the cell Frank had converted, and the one still bare. She looked at Dorothy's broom and Frank's makeshift workbench and the well pump out back. When she left, she told 3 people what she'd seen. Those 3 people told others. By the end of the week, things started arriving. A farmer left a bag of potatoes and a dozen eggs on the front step. A retired electrician named Morris drove out, looked at the wiring, and came back the next day with cable and junction boxes. He spent 2 days getting the first floor wired, running a line from a utility pole at the edge of the property that still had a live connection. Nobody had bothered to disconnect. The first time Dorothy flipped a light switch and the bulb came on, she stood in the corridor and pressed her hand to her chest. "Frank," she called. "Come look." He came from the cell he was working on, saw the light, and laughed. A real laugh, the kind she hadn't heard from him in months. "We've got power," he said. "We've got power." Frank converted the old processing room into a kitchen. He built a counter from lumber, installed a donated sink, connected it to the well pump with pipe fittings from Earl's store. A woman from the church brought a propane camp stove. Another family donated a used refrigerator that hummed and rattled, but kept things cold. Dorothy claimed the exercise yard behind the building. It was a square of dirt enclosed by a low stone wall, open to the sky. She cleared it of weeds and broken concrete, turned the soil with a shovel. Frank had sharpened and planted seeds from packets that cost 89 cents at the dollar store. Beans, tomatoes, squash, and herbs. She planted them in rows as neat and precise as the lesson plans she used to write. By the end of the first month, they had a bedroom, a functioning kitchen, running water, electricity on the first floor, and a garden. Frank had converted 4 more cells into rooms, even though it was just the 2 of them. When Dorothy asked why, he shrugged. "Might as well do them all while I'm at it." She didn't press him, but she noticed he built each room slightly different. One had wider shelves, one had a lower bed frame, one had a lower bed. He was building for people who hadn't arrived yet. She wasn't sure he even knew he was doing it. It was on a Tuesday evening in early December, about 6 weeks after they'd moved in, that Grace appeared. Dorothy was in the kitchen heating soup when she heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, uneven footsteps. She wiped her hands on a towel and went to the front entrance. A young woman stood on the steps, mid-20s, thin, wearing a jacket too light for the weather. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She had a backpack over one shoulder and one hand resting on her stomach, which was round beneath her jacket. 5 or 6 months alone, Dorothy guessed. But it was the bruise that Dorothy saw first. A dark mark along the young woman's jaw, fading from purple to yellow. A week old, maybe more. "I'm sorry to bother you," the young woman said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "My car died about a mile back on the road. I saw the light and I didn't know where else to go." Dorothy opened the door wider. "Come inside. It's cold out there." "I don't want to intrude, I just need to use a phone if you have one." "I have soup," Dorothy said, "and a phone. Come in." The young woman hesitated. She looked past Dorothy into the corridor at the stone walls and the converted cells and the warm light coming from the kitchen. "Is this a jail?" she asked. "It used to be," Dorothy said. "Now it's a home. Come sit down." Her name was Grace. She didn't give a last name and Dorothy didn't ask. She ate 2 bowls of soup and 3 pieces of bread while Dorothy sat across from her and talked about the garden, about Frank's carpentry, about the donated refrigerator that made a sound like a small animal when it cycled on. Frank came in from working on the second floor. He looked at Grace, looked at Dorothy, and went to get another bowl. "Where are you headed?" he asked, setting the bowl in front of her. "Anywhere," Grace said, setting the bowl in front of her. "Anywhere," Grace said. "I left in a hurry. I had a plan, but the car had a different one." "How far along are you?" Dorothy asked gently. Grace's hand went to her stomach. 6 months. "Do you have family somewhere?" Grace shook her head. "Not the kind you can go back to." Dorothy nodded. She didn't push. 35 years of teaching children had taught her that people talk when they're ready and not a moment before. "We have an extra room," Dorothy said. "If you need a place to stay tonight. I don't have any money." "Did I ask for money?" Grace looked at her, then at Frank, then at the kitchen, the warm light, the bowl of soup, the quiet. "Why are you being nice to me?" she asked. "You don't know me." Dorothy reached across the table and put her hand on Grace's. "Because someone should." Grace stayed that night. She was still there the next morning and the morning after that. Frank didn't say anything about it. He just walked into the cell next to theirs, measured the space, and started building a bed frame with a lower profile so Grace wouldn't have to climb in and out. A week later, an old man showed up. His name was Harold, and he was 81. He'd lived in town his whole life. His wife had died 2 years earlier, and the medical bills had taken the house. He'd been sleeping in his car at the church parking lot for 3 months. Earl had told him about the jail. Harold stood in the corridor, hat in his hands, and asked Frank if there was room. Frank looked down the row of cells he'd converted. 8 rooms, each one clean and warm and waiting. "Pick whichever one you like," Frank said. Harold chose the cell closest to the kitchen. Dorothy made up his bed with donated blankets, and that evening 4 people sat around the table Frank had built from salvaged lumber and ate dinner together. Nobody called it a community yet. Nobody called it anything. It was just a building on a gravel road where people who had nowhere to go found a door that was open. 3 days after Harold moved in, a letter arrived. It was from the county code enforcement office, addressed to the property owner. Frank opened it at the kitchen table while Dorothy and Grace washed dishes. He read it twice. Then he set it down and stared at the wall. "What is it?" Dorothy asked. "County's sending an inspector. They want to assess the property for code compliance." He looked at her. "We've got 30 days? Dorothy dried her hands. She picked up the letter and read it. "Structural assessment, electrical inspection, plumbing evaluation, occupancy standards, fire safety. If we fail," Frank said, "they condemn it. We lose everything." Grace stood by the sink watching them. Dorothy folded the letter, set it on the table, and looked at Frank. "Then we've got 30 days, she said. "Better get to work." Frank started the next morning before sunrise. He walked the building with the county letter in his back pocket, looking at everything through an inspector's eyes, instead of a carpenter's. The wiring Morris had done was solid, but only the first floor was connected. The plumbing worked for the kitchen and 1 bathroom near the front entrance, but the upstairs pipes were still dead. The staircase had 2 cracked treads. 3 windows on the second floor had no glass in them at all. He made a list on the back of a grocery bag. 23 items. Some he could handle alone. Some he couldn't. He showed the list to Earl that afternoon. Earl read it, folded the paper, and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll make some calls." 2 days later, 3 trucks pulled up on the gravel road. Earl drove the first one. Behind him came Morris, the retired electrician, and a man Frank hadn't met yet. A plumber named Davis, who'd retired the year before and was bored enough to spend a Saturday in an old jail. "Earl said you needed a hand," Davis said, pulling a toolbox from the bed of his truck. "I need about 12 hands," Frank said. "You've got 6. We'll make it work." They worked through the weekend. Morris ran wire to the second floor and installed code-compliant junction boxes. Davis replaced the worst sections of pipe and got water running to the upstairs bathroom. Frank rebuilt the 2 cracked stair treads, reinforced the railing, and patched the spots on the roof where water had been coming in. Grace helped where she could. She held flashlights, passed tools, swept up debris. Harold made coffee on the camp stove and brought it around to whoever needed it. Dorothy kept a running list of what was done and what still needed doing, the same way she used to track lesson plans. By Sunday evening, they'd knocked 11 items off Frank's list. 12 more to go. Frank said, sitting on the front steps, his hands aching. Earl sat beside him. The window glass is the biggest problem. You can't have open windows in a building where people sleep. Inspector will flag that first. Glass is expensive. I know a guy who does window replacements. He's got seconds and offcuts he can't sell. I'll see what he's got. Frank looked at Earl. Why are you doing all this? You don't owe us anything. Earl was quiet for a moment. I spent 30 months in a jungle in 1968. When I came home, nobody wanted to help me either. Took a long time to figure out I couldn't do it alone. He stood up and brushed off his pants. A good carpenter doesn't tear down what's broken. He figures out what it's supposed to be. Isn't that right? Frank stared at him. Those were his words. He'd said that to Earl 2 weeks ago, offhand while they were sorting lumber at the store. You remembered that, Frank said. I remember everything useful, Earl said. See you Tuesday. The window glass arrived on Thursday. Not seconds or offcuts. New panes cut to size. Delivered by a man in a van who said Earl had already taken care of it and wouldn't discuss it further. Frank installed them over the next 3 days, sealing each one and checking for drafts. With the windows in, the building changed. It held heat better. The corridor was quieter. The rooms felt sealed and private instead of open and exposed. Frank noticed that Harold slept later in the mornings now, and Grace stopped wrapping herself in a blanket at the dinner table. Small things. But small things were the whole point. On a Wednesday in late December, a boy showed up, 17, maybe 18, thin, wearing a hooded sweatshirt and carrying a duffel bag. He stood at the end of the gravel road for nearly an hour before walking up to the front entrance. Grace saw him first. She told Dorothy. Dorothy went outside. Can I help you? She asked. The boy looked at the building, then at her. Is it true you take people in? We have rooms. If you need one, I don't have money. Nobody here does. He told Dorothy his name was Marcus. His parents had kicked him out 2 months ago. He'd been couch surfing, but the last couch ran out a week ago. He'd heard about the jail from a girl at the library who'd heard about it from someone at the church. Dorothy showed him a room on the second floor. He walked in, set his bag on the bed, and stood there looking at the walls. He didn't speak for a while. This was a jail cell, he said. It was, Dorothy said. Feels safer than most places I've slept. Dorothy left him to settle in. When she came back downstairs, Frank was at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, sketching something on a piece of cardboard. What's that? She asked. A table. A bigger one. This one seats 4. We need one that seats 8. Dorothy looked at him. You think more people are coming? Frank set down his pencil. I think we stopped asking that question about 2 weeks ago. He built the new table over the next 3 days. 8 feet long, made from lumber scraps and salvaged planks, sanded smooth and sealed with oil Earl donated from a dented can at the store. It was the best piece of furniture Frank had built in years, and he built it from scraps in a jail. The first night they all sat at it together, 5 people plus Frank and Dorothy, eating bean soup and cornbread that Grace had made from a recipe Dorothy taught her. Nobody said much. They just ate. Harold told a story about a fish he'd caught 40 years ago. Marcus laughed. Grace asked for seconds. Dorothy refilled bowls. Frank sat at the head of the table and watched. This was the moment it became something. Not just a shelter, not just a building. A household. If you've made it this far into Frank and Dorothy's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Dorothy started a reading group. Not formally, nothing planned. She found a box of donated paperbacks in the back of Earl's truck. One afternoon, westerns and mysteries and a few romance novels with cracked spines. She set them on a shelf in the old booking room near the front entrance and mentioned to Marcus that he was welcome to borrow anything. Marcus read 3 books in a week. He hadn't read a book since dropping out of school 2 years earlier. He came to Dorothy with questions about words he didn't know, and she answered them patiently, and before either of them realized it, they were having daily lessons at the kitchen table while Harold peeled potatoes and Grace folded laundry. Dorothy hadn't taught in 5 years. She'd missed it every day. Frank, meanwhile, turned the largest cell on the first floor into a workshop. He set up a bench, organized his growing collection of donated tools, and started repairing furniture that people in town dropped off. A chair with a broken leg, a dresser with a stuck drawer, a cradle with a cracked rocker. He fixed them all and sent them back. He didn't charge. People started bringing more, and they started bringing other things too. Groceries, clothing, cleaning supplies, not charity exactly, more like an exchange. Frank fixed what was broken. The town filled in what was missing. It was Harold who first noticed what the garden had become. Dorothy had planted it as a survival measure, food they could grow themselves. But by mid-January, the wintergreens were coming up strong. The cold frames she'd built from old window panes were working, and there was more than enough for the 7 people living in the jail. "We've got extra," Harold said one morning, holding a basket of kale and turnips. "More than we can eat." Dorothy looked at the basket. "Then we share it." Harold drove the extras into town in Earl's truck and left bags on doorsteps. The food bank at the church got a donation. The diner got a bag of herbs. The people who had been feeding Frank and Dorothy were now being fed by them. That mattered. Dorothy knew it mattered because she'd spent 35 years watching children understand the difference between receiving help and being part of something. One makes you grateful, the other makes you whole. In the evenings, they gathered in the common room Frank had built from the old mess hall. He'd installed a wood-burning stove, donated by a farmer who'd upgraded to propane. The stove heated the room enough that they could sit together without coats, which felt like a luxury. Harold told stories. He'd lived in the county his whole life and knew every family, every scandal, every good deed. Grace knitted. She'd learned from her grandmother and hadn't done it in years, but Dorothy found a bag of yarn at a thrift store and brought it home, and Grace picked it up again like she'd never stopped. Marcus sat in the corner and read. Sometimes he'd look up from his book and watch the others, and Dorothy would catch an expression on his face that she recognized. She'd seen it on hundreds of third graders over the years, the look of a child realizing they belong somewhere. One evening in late January, Dorothy was alone in the kitchen washing dishes when the phone rang. It was a prepaid cell phone Earl had given them. Nothing fancy, but it worked. She answered. There was a pause, and then a voice she knew. Mom, Stephen. Dorothy gripped the edge of the counter. She hadn't heard his voice in 5 months. "Stephen, I heard about what you're doing out there. Aunt Helen told me. Aunt Helen has always been better at keeping in touch." Stephen ignored that. "Mom, listen. I've been thinking about your situation, and I think we need to talk about a more realistic arrangement. There are facilities that specialize in older adults who need structured living. We have structured living, Stephen. Frank built most of the structure himself. You're living in a jail, Mom. We're living in our home. It's not appropriate. You're 73 years old, Dad's 76. You can't be running some kind of, a shelter. We're not running anything. We just leave the door open, silence on the other end. Mom, I'm trying to help." Dorothy set down the dish she was holding. "You tried to help 5 months ago. You dropped us at a motel with 2 suitcases and drove away. You never called. You never checked. You never came back." Her voice was even, steady. "We're fine, Stephen. We're more than fine. We're needed here. I was going to call. Things got busy with the development project and it doesn't matter. The point is, you can't keep doing this. Watch us." She hung up, set the phone on the counter, stood there for a minute with both hands flat on the surface, breathing. Grace came in from the common room. She looked at Dorothy's face and didn't say anything. She just picked up a dish towel and started drying. After a while, Dorothy said, "That was my son, I figured. He thinks we need to be in a facility." Grace dried a plate carefully and set it on the shelf. "My mother used to say that the people who tell you what's best for you are usually the ones who don't want to deal with you." Dorothy looked at her. This girl who had shown up on their doorstep 6 weeks ago, pregnant, bruised, and scared. She was standing in the kitchen now with steady hands and a straight back, drying dishes in a home she'd helped build. "Your mother was a smart woman," Dorothy said. She had her moments. They finished the dishes in silence. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. The kind that says, "I'm here, and that's enough." The last 2 weeks before the inspection were a blur. Frank worked 14-hour days. Earl came out every other morning. Morris double-checked every electrical connection. Davis pressure-tested the pipes. Grace painted the corridor walls with donated paint, a soft cream color that made the stone look warmer. Marcus installed weather stripping on every door. Harold organized the storage rooms and labeled everything. Frank built a fire escape for the 2nd floor. A set of exterior stairs, steel and wood, bolted to the stone wall with brackets he welded himself using a borrowed torch from Earl's shop. It took 4 days and most of his remaining energy, but when the inspector came, there would be a code-compliant exit from every floor. On the night before the inspection, they all sat at the long table for dinner. Nobody talked about what would happen tomorrow. Dorothy made chicken stew from a donated bird and vegetables from the garden. Harold said, "Grace." Marcus passed the bread. Grace ladled soup. Frank looked around the table. 7 people. 3 months ago, there had been 2. He caught Dorothy's eye across the table. She gave him a small nod, the same nod she'd given him on their wedding day, and on the day they brought their first child home, and on the night she'd hung a curtain on the bars of a jail cell and called it a window. It meant, "We're ready, whatever comes." The next morning, Frank was up before dawn. He walked the building one more time, checked every light switch, every faucet, every window latch, tested the fire escape, swept the corridor. At 9:15, a white sedan appeared at the far end of the gravel road, trailing a cloud of dust behind it. Frank stood on the front steps and watched it come. Dorothy came out and stood beside him. Grace and Harold and Marcus gathered behind them in the doorway. The sedan pulled up. A man got out, mid-50s, gray jacket, clipboard in hand. He looked at the building, then at the people standing in front of it, then back at the building. He walked up the steps. Frank extended his hand. "Frank Mercer. This is my wife, Dorothy. Welcome to our home." The inspector shook his hand, looked at his clipboard, looked at the old stone jail with its barred windows and patched roof and new fire escape and a guard invisible around the side. "I'm here to conduct a property assessment," he said. "Shall we go inside?" Frank held the door open. "After you." The inspector stepped through the front door and stopped. He stood in the corridor for a good 10 seconds without moving. His clipboard hung at his side. His pen hovered over the first line of the form without touching it. Frank watched him. He'd seen that look before. He'd seen it on homeowners' faces when they walked into a room. He'd just finished. The moment when their eyes took in something they hadn't expected. The corridor was clean and lit. The stone walls had been scrubbed and painted cream. The old concrete floor had been swept, patched, and covered with donated rugs in the high-traffic areas. Overhead, functional light fixtures ran the length of the ceiling, wired into junction boxes that met code. But it was the cells that stopped him. Each one had been transformed. The iron bars on the fronts were gone, replaced by wooden door frames with solid doors that latched from the inside. Through the open doorways, the inspector could see beds with clean blankets, shelves with personal items, curtains on the windows. Each room was different. One had a rocking chair in the corner. One had a small bookshelf built into the wall. One had a hand-knitted blanket folded at the foot of the bed and a pair of baby shoes sitting on the shelf. The inspector walked slowly down the corridor, looking into each room. He checked his clipboard, made a note, and kept walking. Frank followed a few steps behind. Dorothy walked beside the inspector, pointing out the fire extinguisher mounted near the stairwell, the smoke detectors Frank had installed in every room, the clearly marked exits. They reached the kitchen. The inspector stood in the doorway and looked at the long table, the counter Frank had built, the donated stove and refrigerator, the shelves of canned goods and dry goods, organized by type. A pot of coffee sat on the burner. The room smelled like bread. "How many people live here?" the inspector asked. "7, Dorothy said, "including my husband and me." "And these are all residents? Do you have any kind of license to operate?" "We're not operating anything," Frank said. "People needed a place to stay. We had rooms." The inspector looked at Frank, then at the kitchen, then down at his clipboard. He wrote something. They went upstairs. The inspector tested the handrail, which held firm. He checked the electrical outlets, the light switches, the plumbing in the upstairs bathroom. He opened and closed windows. He stepped out onto the fire escape and tested the railing, bounced on the treads, and came back inside. "Who built this?" he asked, pointing to the fire escape. "I did," Frank said. "You welded these brackets. Borrowed a torch from a friend." The inspector crouched down and examined the connection where steel met stone. The bolts were clean, the welds solid. He stood up and wrote something else on his clipboard. They walked the perimeter of the building. The inspector checked the foundation, the roof line, the drainage around the base. He looked at the well pump and asked about the water quality. Dorothy showed him the test results from the county health office, which she'd had done the month before. When they circled back to the front entrance, the inspector stood on the steps and flipped through his notes. He'd been in the building for 45 minutes. Frank's hands were in his pockets. Dorothy stood beside him with her arms crossed. "Mr. Mercer," the inspector said, "I'm going to be honest with you. I drove out here this morning expecting to condemn this building. I'd reviewed the county records. This property has been listed as uninhabitable since 1997. "It was uninhabitable," Frank said. "We fixed it." "You did more than fix it." The inspector looked at his notes. "Your electrical work meets code. Your plumbing passes. The structural integrity of the building is sound. The fire escape is, frankly, better than what I see in most commercial buildings." He paused. "There are a few items. The second-floor bathroom needs a ventilation fan. You need a handrail on the exterior steps at the front entrance, and I'd recommend a carbon monoxide detector near the wood stove." Frank nodded. "I can have all 3 done by next week." The inspector closed his clipboard. "I'll file this as conditionally compliant. You'll have 30 days to address those items, and then I'll do a follow-up." He looked at Frank, then at Dorothy, then at the building behind them. "I came here to shut this down. I can't." He shook Frank's hand and walked back to his car. Before he got in, he turned around. "Mr. Mercer, the doors in those rooms, they all latch from the inside." "That's right," Frank said. "In a jail, the doors lock from the outside. This isn't a jail anymore." The inspector looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said, "it isn't." He drove away down the gravel road, and Frank stood on the steps until the dust settled. Dorothy came up behind him and put her hand on his shoulder. "We passed," she said. "We passed." He put his hand over hers. They stood there for a while, not saying anything else. Harold came outside and asked if everything was all right. Grace appeared in the doorway. Marcus leaned against the wall. "Everything's fine," Dorothy said. "We're staying." The ventilation fan, the handrail, and the carbon monoxide detector were installed by Friday. Earl provided the materials. Frank did the work. When the inspector came back 2 weeks later for the follow-up, he spent 10 minutes inside, checked the 3 items, signed off, and told Frank to take care of himself. That should have been the end of it. A quiet victory. A building that passed inspection. Life going on. But the reporter from the county paper had been at the courthouse when the inspection results were filed. She noticed the address and the classification. A former county jail, occupied, conditionally compliant, residentially compliant, residential use. She drove out to Hadley Road on a Wednesday afternoon with a camera and a notebook. Her name was Rebecca, but she didn't give it at first. She just knocked on the door and asked if she could talk to whoever lived there. Dorothy invited her in, offered coffee, showed her around. Frank shook her hand and answered her questions. Grace said hello and went back to her knitting. Harold told her about the garden. Marcus, quiet and cautious, stayed in his room until Dorothy coaxed him out. The reporter stayed for 3 hours. She took photographs of the corridor, the kitchen, the garden, the workshop, the rooms. She sat at the long table and wrote notes while Dorothy told her the story from the beginning. The 2 suitcases, the motel, the $6, the first night on the concrete floor. The article ran the following Sunday. Front page of the county paper. The headline read, "Couple abandoned by children, turns jail into home for the forgotten." The paper had a website. The article was shared, and then it was shared again. And again. Within a week, 3 television stations had called. A national morning show reached out. A national morning show reached out. A journalist from a wire service drove 4 hours to do an interview. Frank did the first 2 interviews and then told Dorothy he was done talking. Dorothy handled the rest with the same calm patience she'd used to manage 25 third graders during a fire drill. The coverage changed. Things. Donations arrived. Not just blankets and canned food anymore. Checks. Gift cards. A lumber company in the next county donated a full load of materials. A plumbing supply house sent fixtures. A retired architect offered to draw up plans for a proper kitchen renovation, free of charge. Frank accepted the materials. He was hesitant about the money. "We didn't ask for this," he said to Dorothy one evening, holding a check for $500 from a woman in another state. "We didn't ask for any of it," Dorothy said. "The blankets, the eggs, Earl's credit line. We just did the work and people responded. It feels different now, bigger. It is bigger. That's not a bad thing." The donations allowed Frank to finish the second floor properly. He built 6 more rooms upstairs, each one complete with a bed, a shelf unit, a small closet, and a door that latched from the inside. Dorothy furnished them with donated items. By February, the building had capacity for 14 people, and 10 of the rooms were occupied. New residents arrived in ones and twos, a woman in her 60s, whose landlord had sold her building, a young couple who'd been living in their car since the husband lost his construction job, a veteran in his 40s who didn't talk much but helped Frank in the workshop every day without being asked. Dorothy kept things organized. She posted a schedule in the kitchen. Meal duties rotated. Everyone contributed what they could. The woman who'd lost her apartment turned out to be a former nurse. She checked everyone's blood pressure and reminded Harold to take his medication. The construction worker fixed things Frank couldn't get to. The veteran sanded and stained the new furniture in the workshop with quiet precision. It worked, not perfectly. There were arguments about bathroom schedules and whose turn it was to clean the common room. Marcus and the construction worker's wife had a disagreement about the radio that lasted 3 days. Grace cried one night and wouldn't tell anyone why. Harold snored so loud the person in the next room stuffed a towel under the door. But it worked. People adjusted. People helped each other. People, it turned out, were pretty good at building a life together when they had no other choice. It was on a Saturday in late February that Stephen's car appeared on the gravel road. Frank was in the workshop. He heard the engine before he saw the vehicle. It was a different sound from the trucks and older cars that usually came out here. Quieter, more expensive. He walked to the front entrance and saw the black SUV parked on the gravel. Stephen stood beside it, looking at the building the way a man looks at something he can't quite process. Dorothy came out of the kitchen. She saw Stephen and stopped in the corridor. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she walked to the front entrance and stood beside Frank. "Stephen," she said. "Mom." "Dad." He was wearing a suit jacket and dress shoes, which was the wrong choice for a gravel road. His shoes were already dusty. He looked at the building, at the garden wall visible around the corner, at the fire escape on the side, at the sign Dorothy had put up by the entrance that read, "All welcome." "I saw the news coverage," Stephen said. "I drove down this morning." "I know. First time you've made it in over 8 months. Stephen's jaw tightened. "Can we talk inside?" They sat at the long table. Dorothy made coffee. Stephen looked around the kitchen at the counter Frank had built. The shelves of donated goods, the garden herbs drying on hooks near the window. His eyes moved over everything quickly, the way they did when he was assessing a property for his development firm. "This isn't sustainable," Stephen said. "You're operating what amounts to a group home without licensing, without insurance, without any kind of professional oversight. One injury and you're liable for everything." "We've been here 5 months, Stephen," Frank said. "Nobody's been injured." "That's luck, Dad. Not a plan. We have a plan. We take care of people. People take care of us." Stephen leaned forward. "That's not a plan. That's a nice idea. In the real world, nice ideas get you sued." "In the real world," Dorothy said, her voice level, "people get dropped at motels by their children and never hear from them again." Stephen went still. "You left us," Dorothy said. "You left us with 2 suitcases and a promise you never meant to keep. We called. We waited. We sat in a motel room watching our money disappear, and you never picked up the phone." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "We built this with $6 in these hands." She put her palm flat on the table Frank had built. "You don't get to walk in here and tell us it's not enough." Stephen looked at the table, at his mother's hand, at his father sitting across from him, silent and steady. "I was going to call," Stephen said. "But you didn't." "Things were. I had the Henderson project, and the permits were delayed. And it got away from me." "We got away from you," Dorothy said. "Say it right." Stephen pressed his lips together. He looked around the kitchen again, but this time he wasn't assessing property. He was looking at the hand-knitted dish towels, the jars of herbs, the drawings Marcus had taped to the refrigerator, the schedule Dorothy had posted with everyone's name. "How many people live here?" he asked quietly. 12, Frank said, "not counting us. And they all just showed up. They all needed somewhere to go. We had somewhere." Stephen rubbed his face. "This is on the news, Mom. National news. My business associates have seen it. My clients. And that's what brought you here," Dorothy said. "Your clients." Stephen looked at her. For a second, his expression cracked. Just a flash, gone quickly, but Dorothy saw it. She'd been reading faces for 35 years. She saw the guilt underneath the suit and the talking points. "I don't know how to fix this," Stephen said. "This isn't yours to fix," Frank said. "This isn't broken." Stephen stood up, pushed his chair back, looked at his parents one more time. "I'll have my attorney look into the licensing requirements. There may be a way to formalize this." "We don't need your attorney," Dorothy said. "You might. Whether you want my help or not, the county is going to start asking questions about occupancy and zoning. I can at least let me do that much." He walked out, got into his SUV, sat there for a minute without starting the engine. Then he drove away. Frank watched him go from the front steps. Dorothy stood in the corridor behind him. "He's scared," she said. Frank turned to look at her. Scared of what? Of what we did without him, of what that means about who he is. That evening, the phone rang. Dorothy answered. It was her daughter. "Mom." Her voice was thick. She'd been crying. "I saw the article. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't come sooner. I wanted to. I kept telling myself I'd call, and then Stephen said not to, and I let him decide. I let him decide for all of us, and I'm sorry." Dorothy sat down on the edge of her bed. The cell that had become her bedroom, with Frank's handmade bed frame and the curtain she'd hung on the first night and their wedding photo on the shelf. "Are you all right?" Dorothy asked. "Am I all right? Mom, you're the one living in a jail. I'm living in my home, with people I love. I'm asking about you." Her daughter cried for a while. Dorothy listened. "Can I come see you?" her daughter finally asked. "Can I bring the kids?" "The door's open," Dorothy said. "It's always been open." She hung up and sat in the quiet for a while. Frank came in and sat beside her. "The kids?" he asked. Dorothy nodded. "She's coming." Frank took her hand. "Good." They sat together on the bed in their cell in their home and listened to the sounds of the building around them. Harold coughing in his room, Grace humming to herself in the kitchen, Marcus turning pages, the veteran sanding something in the workshop below, the steady rhythm of it carrying through the stone walls. "Frank," Dorothy said. "Yeah. Do you remember what this place looked like the first time we saw it?" "I remember. Do you know what it looks like now?" Frank squeezed her hand. He didn't answer because they both already knew. Spring came slowly that year. The frost held on through March and the mornings stayed cold enough that Frank kept the wood stove burning until April. But the garden didn't care about the calendar. The peas came up first, then the lettuce, then the tomato seedlings that Dorothy had started in paper cups on the kitchen windowsill. By mid-April, the exercise yard behind the jail was green. Grace had her baby on a Tuesday in March. A girl, 6 pounds and 9 ounces, born at the county hospital with Dorothy holding one hand and the retired nurse holding the other. Frank drove them there in Earl's truck at 2 in the morning, going 15 miles above the speed limit for the first time in his life. They named her Rose. Grace never explained why she chose that name, and nobody asked. But Dorothy noticed that Grace held the baby the way a person holds something they've been waiting for without knowing it. Carefully, completely. Frank built a crib. He'd built 3 cribs in his life, one for each of his own children, and this one was better than any of them. Cherry-stained pine, smooth as glass, with slats spaced to code and a mattress platform that adjusted to 2 heights. He spent 4 days on it, sanding every surface twice, and when he set it in Grace's room, he stood back and looked at it with the same expression he'd had when he finished the fire escape. The expression of a man who'd built something that would hold. Grace moved the crib next to her bed and put Rose down for her first nap at home in a jail cell that had been converted into a nursery in a building that used to hold prisoners and now held a family. The nonprofit paperwork went through in April. A lawyer in the county seat had seen the news coverage and offered to handle the filing pro bono. They registered as the Open Door Community Home. Dorothy filled out the forms at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her reading glasses, the same glasses Frank had packed in the suitcase that first morning at the motel, a lifetime ago. The registration changed things. They could accept donations officially. They could apply for grants. A foundation in the state capitol sent a check that covered the building insurance for a year. A church group donated industrial kitchen equipment. The county extended their water and sewer connections at no cost. Frank used the donated materials to finish the second floor. Proper insulation, proper drywall, proper lighting. Each room had a window with glass that opened and closed, a bed with a real mattress, a small closet, and a door with a lock that worked from the inside. He installed a bathroom on each floor with hot water from a donated water heater. 14 rooms. 14 doors, all of them opening from the inside. Marcus got his GD in May. Dorothy tutored him for 4 months, sitting at the kitchen table every morning before breakfast, working through math problems and reading comprehension exercises. She used the same patient, steady approach she'd used with hundreds of third graders, except Marcus was 18 and hadn't been in a classroom in 2 years. The day the results came, Marcus walked into the kitchen with the letter in his hand and a look on his face that Dorothy hadn't seen before. "I passed," he said. 92nd percentile in reading. Harold clapped him on the back. Grace hugged him. The veteran shook his hand. Dorothy put the letter on the refrigerator door, next to the drawings and the meal schedule, and the photo someone had taken of all of them at the long table on Christmas Eve. "What you want to do next?" Dorothy asked him. Marcus looked at the letter on the refrigerator. "I want to go to school. Real school. I think I want to study building trades." He looked at Frank when he said it. Frank nodded once, slowly. "I can write you a recommendation," Frank said. "I've been your teacher for 5 months. I've got things to say." Marcus enrolled at the community college in the fall. He drove there in a car that Earl found for him, an old sedan with bad paint and good brakes, for $200. The daughter came in June. She drove up the gravel road in a minivan with her 2 children in the back seat, a boy of 9 and a girl of 7. She parked in front of the jail and sat in the car for a long time before getting out. Dorothy watched from the kitchen window. She didn't go outside. She waited. The daughter opened the car door, stood up, and looked at the building. She looked at the garden wall, the fire escape, the sign by the entrance that read "All Welcome." She looked at the window boxes that Grace had planted with flowers. She looked at the porch Frank had built from reclaimed lumber with 2 rocking chairs and a bench. Then she looked at the front door, which was open. She walked in. The children followed, holding her hands. They stood in the corridor and looked at the cream-painted walls, the light fixtures, the row of rooms with their wooden doors. "Mom," she called. Dorothy came out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. She looked at her daughter, standing in the corridor with a grandchild on each side. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Hi, Mom," her daughter said. Her voice broke on the second word. "Come in," Dorothy said. "There's lemonade." They sat at the long table. The grandchildren drank lemonade and ate cookies that Grace had baked that morning. Harold showed them the garden. Marcus let the boy try the handsaw in the workshop, with Frank standing right behind him, guiding the blade. The daughter watched all of it. She watched her father teach her son to cut a straight line. She watched her mother pour lemonade and ask her granddaughter about school. She watched Grace carry Rose on one hip while setting out plates with the other hand. She watched Harold carefully deadheading the tomato plants while explaining to the 9-year-old which ones were ready to pick. After lunch, the daughter and Dorothy walked the building together. Just the 2 of them. They went room by room, and Dorothy told her about each person who lived there, where they'd come from, what they'd lost, what they were building now. When they reached Frank and Dorothy's room, the daughter stopped in the doorway. "This was a cell," she said. "It was." The daughter looked at the bed Frank had built, the curtain on the window, the wedding photograph on the shelf, the same photograph from 1972. Frank in a borrowed suit, Dorothy in her mother's dress. Dad built all of this, most of it. He had help, a lot of help. The daughter put her hand on the doorframe. "Mom, I need to say something, and I need you to hear it." "I'm listening." I knew when Stephen came up with a plan, I knew it wasn't temporary. I knew he wasn't going to call, I knew, and I didn't stop it. I told myself he'd handle it, that he knew what was best, and I went along with it because it was easier. She pressed her forehead against the door frame. "I let you down, both of you. I knew the whole time, and I chose to look away." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "You knew. I've been reading children's faces for 35 years. I saw it in your eyes the morning Stephen drove us away. You knew. And you were ashamed." Her daughter's shoulders shook. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," Dorothy said. "It wasn't fine. It hurt. It still hurts. But you're here now. You came. Is that enough? It's a start." They stood there in the doorway of the cell that had become a bedroom, and Dorothy let her daughter cry. She didn't reach for her. She didn't comfort her. She let her feel the weight of it, because that was the only honest thing to do. After a while, her daughter straightened up and wiped her face. "Can I come back regularly? Can the kids get to know you again?" "The door's open," Dorothy said. "It always has been." The daughter stayed 3 days. She helped Grace with the baby. She weeded the garden with Harold. She sat with Frank in the workshop and watched him build, the way she used to watch him when she was a girl, and he'd bring her to job sites on Saturday mornings. On the last morning, her son asked Frank if he could come back and learn more about the saw. "Anytime," Frank said. "I'll teach you everything I know." The daughter started coming every month after that. Then, every 2 weeks, she brought groceries and cleaning supplies and books for Dorothy's reading group. She never mentioned Stephen. Stephen never came back. Dorothy didn't expect him to. Some people need longer to face the things they've done, and some people never face them at all. She didn't hate him, she couldn't. She'd spent 40 years loving him before she spent 8 months being hurt by him. But she stopped waiting for his call, and that was its own kind of peace. The youngest son called every Sunday evening. He lived on the West Coast and couldn't visit easily, but he called. He asked about the garden, about the residents, about Frank's latest project. He sent money every month, always to Dorothy, never to Stephen. He never explained why he'd been out of touch before, and Dorothy never asked. He was here now. That was enough. By autumn, the open door had become something the town depended on. Earl sent people there when they came into his store looking lost. The pastor referred families. The county social services office started calling Dorothy directly when someone needed emergency housing. Frank kept building. He added a covered porch that wrapped around the side of the building facing the garden. He built benches and a long outdoor table for summer meals. He built a play area for Rose and any other children who might come. He built bookshelves for the reading room that Dorothy had set up in the old booking area near the entrance. He was 77 now. His knees ached every morning. His back gave him trouble on cold days. He moved slower than he had 6 months ago, and he dropped things sometimes because his grip wasn't what it used to be. But he kept working because working was how Frank Mercer understood the world. You measured, you cut, you built, and when it was done, it held. On a Thursday in October, almost exactly a year after Frank and Dorothy had first walked up to the abandoned jail, a car pulled up on the gravel road. An elderly man and woman got out. He was maybe 70, she was a few years younger. They stood in the driveway and looked at the building. The woman was holding a small suitcase in one hand and her husband's arm with the other. The man's face had the expression Frank recognized, because he'd worn it himself a year ago. The expression of someone trying to figure out how they ended up here. Dorothy went outside. "Can I help you?" she asked. The woman spoke. "Our son," he said. "We'd be staying at his place in the city, but when we got there, the locks were changed. He won't answer his phone." She paused. "Someone at the church told us about this place." Dorothy looked at them, the suitcase, the confusion, the quiet, careful dignity of people who don't want to admit they've been thrown away. "Come inside," Dorothy said. "I'll put the kettle on." She walked them through the corridor, past the rooms where people had made lives out of nothing, past the kitchen where Grace was feeding Rose in a high chair Frank had built, past the reading room where Marcus was studying for his midterms, past the garden door where Harold was pulling the last tomatoes of the season. She showed them to a room on the second floor. Clean bed, warm blankets, a window with a view of the garden and the hills beyond. The woman set her suitcase down and looked around. "This is very kind of you." "It's a room," Dorothy said, "but it can be a home if you let it." That evening, 16 people sat at the long table for dinner. Frank said a few words before they ate. He wasn't a man who liked speeches, so he kept it short. "A year ago, Dorothy and I had 2 suitcases and $6. We didn't know what we were doing. We still don't most days." A few laughs around the table, but we know one thing. We didn't rescue anyone. We just left the door open. Everyone here rescued themselves. He sat down. Dorothy reached for his hand under the table. After dinner, the two of them sat on the porch in the rocking chairs. The October air was cool but not cold. The garden was brown and gold. Lights glowed in the windows behind them, and the sounds of dishes being washed and people talking carried through the stone walls. Dorothy pulled the photograph from her purse. She'd carried it every day for a year. Frank in a borrowed suit, Dorothy in her mother's dress, both of them grinning. Frank looked at it. "We look so young," he said. "We look so sure about everything. Were we right?" Dorothy looked over her shoulder at the building behind them, at the lights in every window. At the iron bars on the ground floor, the ones she'd once run her hand across on a cold November afternoon, someone had planted morning glories at the base of the wall in the spring, and the vines had climbed the bars all summer, winding through the iron, covering them in green. The flowers were gone now, but the vines held on, and in the evening light the bars looked less like a cage, and more like a trellis. We were right about the only thing that mattered, she said. Frank nodded. He put the photograph on the arm of the rocking chair between them where they could both see it. They sat together on the porch of the building they'd bought for $6 and turned into something no one could have imagined. The door behind them was open. It always was.
With judgment, but with perfect reflection. This is where people get confused and